Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this event with Daniel Fryer. And as well as that, thanks for any of you who have been able to join any of the other events across Mental Health Awareness Week. I am just doing a quick introduction of Daniel. This presentation is about his book, his self-therapy book, about it's the 4 thoughts that you up. And it's a great book. I have read it myself. A wonderful book. And Daniel himself is a psychotherapist, a hypnotherapist. He's a public speaker, as well as an author then of the book that I've just mentioned. He's a former journalist, sorry. And I mean, I'm just gonna crack on, get Daniel in, and he can start the presentation.
Lovely. Thank you for the introduction, Amber, and hello, everybody. Before I start, I just want to add that if you hear any snoring, it's not me, it's my dog. She's on the floor by my feet. So any snoring, definitely not me, just the dog. As Amber said, the book and the presentation is called The 4 Thoughts That Fuck You Up and How to Fix Them. And you can join in at Slido and you can ask questions along the way, but I think we're going to save the questions to the end. I'm going to talk for about 35 to 40 minutes, and I'm going to introduce you to a form of therapy known as rational emotive behavior therapy, which is essentially what my book is all about. REBT has got a philosophy, and its philosophy is that the problem isn't the problem is your attitude to the problem, and there's bonus points to anyone that can tell me where that quote is from. REBT is all about beliefs, so I'll be talking about what we mean by beliefs and how they can F you up. I will be giving you some points to ponder, which are the kind of essentials of REBT. I'll be talking about something known as the ABCDE model of psychological health. And then I'll be relating REBT to kindness. Kindness is the theme for this year's Mental Health Week, but also REBT is a core concept. Kindness is a core concept of REBT. Kindness is also a core concept of positive psychology, which is another form of therapy that I advocate. I run groups in hospital settings on both REBT and positive psychology, so kindness crops up quite a lot. Yeah. At the end of the talk and before the Q&A, I will be, if you'll allow me, giving you a massive shameless plug for the book. Now, rational emotive behavior therapy, REBT, is a form of cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT. It was developed in the 1950s by a guy called Albert Ellis. It's actually considered to be the first form of CBT, but very few people outside the realms of psychotherapy have even heard of it, including people that have actually had it as their main form of therapy. And it was developed by a guy called Albert Ellis, who is a bit of an unsung hero in the therapy world. There's like a top 10 list of the most influential psychotherapists in history, and he sits at number 2. Freud comes in at number 3. One of the reasons he's rated so highly is that REBT isn't just considered a form of psychotherapy, which means it's excellent at working on very specific problems, but it's also considered a school of thought. So it's an excellent way of just looking at life and its ups and downs in a healthier and more rational way. It has a philosophy and it has a structure that I'm just very briefly going to introduce you to. And its philosophy is actually based on Stoic philosophy, especially the teachings of a philosopher called Epictetus, who said that it's not the events in life that disturb you, it's what you tell yourself about those events that disturbs you. So if you're stuck, if you're thinking and feeling and acting in ways that you don't like, but don't seem to be able to change, it's not because of the thing, it's down to what you're telling yourself about the thing. Change what it is that you tell yourself, and you get to change how you think, how you feel, and how you act. This means that nobody makes you angry, nothing makes you anxious, nobody or nothing makes you depressed. It's what you tell yourself. Now, we're not saying that when stuff happens, it doesn't have an influence, because it does. Life gets negative, life gets challenging, life is very challenging at the moment. But even in the face of difficulty and negativity and challenge, you can still remain in control or regain control if you think you've lost it by looking at what it is that you're telling yourself. So it's all about beliefs. It's all about your interpretation of events. And to highlight what we mean by beliefs and how they can disturb you or keep you rational, I'm just going to go through a couple of scenarios. In both scenarios, there is a presenter who presents for a living, so presenting is very important to him. And in both scenarios, the presenter has developed kind of an unconscious belief system about presenting. He's not consciously aware that this is what his mind is telling him. It's kind of a thought process chugging away in the background. First belief is this: I absolutely must do well in all my presentations. It's going to be awful and unbearable if I don't do well in my presentations. And if I don't do well, it's all my fault. I'm an idiot. I'm a failure. I'm no good. Now, with that as a belief system, as a presenter, I'm going to make myself very, very stressed and anxious about my presentations. Every time there is a presentation, in the days leading up to it, I'm probably going to wind myself up more and more. I'll probably have very poor sleep. On the day, my stress will be very evident. My anxiety will be very evident. And then in that state of mind, it's less likely that the presentation will go well. And just as importantly, if any mistakes get made, then with that as my belief system, it's going to be a calamity and I'm not going to handle any errors well at all. Now, the second scenario is this: same situation. I present, I've got a presentation coming up. Presentations are very important to me, but this time unconsciously, my belief system is this: I'd like to do well in all my presentations, but I know I don't have to. I'm not going to like it if I don't, but at the same time, I recognize that it's not going to be the end of the world. It's not going to be unbearable. I'm not a failure. I'm not an idiot. Even if it doesn't go well, I'm a worthwhile, fallible human being who just didn't do well that time. Now, if that is my philosophy, then in any presentation in the days leading up to it, I'm going to be calmer and more relaxed. I'm going to rehearse, but I'm not going to over-rehearse. My sleep will be better. On the day, I'm going to come across as more calm and more relaxed, nervously excited, hopefully, because I still prefer to do well, and so that will be communicated, but otherwise more calm and more competent. More importantly, if anything does go wrong, which things do from time to time, I'm hopefully going to deal with that in a much more calmer and more appropriate manner. So it's all about beliefs. An essential component of REBT is this: all human beings, all of us, everywhere, we're all prone to emotional disturbance when we don't get what we demand we must have. And we're prone to further emotional disturbance, even if we do get the thing we demand we must have, because we can always lose it. It can be taken away. Things can change. It's only when we can assert a preference, but at the same time accept that we don't always get those things that we prefer, then we can remain psychologically healthy. So by that, we mean the difference between nervous but calm and competent in the face of a presentation, and stressed and anxious in the face of the same presentation. Now, all human beings are prone to emotional disturbance when they don't get what they demand they must have is central. In REBT, we don't like words such as must, mustn't, should, shouldn't, got to, and have to. Collectively, we call them dogmatic demands. And dogmatic demand is the first thought that F's you up. It's public enemy number one, according to REBT. A dogmatic demand is the rigid expression of a desire for something. So in the scenario earlier, it was the rigid expression of the desire to do well. I must, end of. Doesn't allow for any other option or wiggle room, and it doesn't allow for the possibility of mistakes. Now, people who hold demands are much more likely to authorize or catastrophize, to make things worse than they actually are. We have expressions in the English language that cover this one very, very nicely. Making a mountain out of a molehill, making a drama out of a crisis, hence the belief doing a drama. So if I say it's awful, if my presentation goes well, doesn't go well, I'm actually making it worse than it actually is. People who hold demands also have a tendency to exhibit what we call low frustration tolerance. It's where they believe that they couldn't cope, or they couldn't handle it, or they couldn't deal with the situation if it went wrong. And the fourth and final thought that can F you up, when people hold demands, they tend to exhibit what we call pejorative put downs. Now, you can put yourself down. I'm a failure. I'm an idiot. You can put other people down. You're a failure. You're an idiot. And you can put things down as well. So the presentation was completely rubbish. So they are the four thoughts, according to REBT, that F you up. And by F you up, we mean they are at the core of any kind of emotional disturbance. So if you're anxious, if you're angry, if you're depressed, if you're jealous, and so on, there will always be a demand, possibly an I can't cope, possibly a drama belief, and possibly a put down. People also just tend to look at things in general in that way, without in specific contexts. So some people are very demanding. Some people have a tendency to authorize. Some people have very poor resilience in the face of challenges. And some people are very, very critical of the self and very critical of others. Now, every single one of those unhealthy beliefs has a healthy, rational equivalent. The four thoughts that can fix those beliefs. The first one is known as a flexible preference. It's the flexible expression of exactly the same desire. So instead of going, I must do well, I go, well, I prefer to do well, but I don't have to. I'm still saying what I would like to happen, doing well, but I also accept that reality sometimes lies. People who hold preferences are much more likely to possess perspective. They see things as they are. They don't make them any worse. They just see things as they are. So if it doesn't go well, I'm not going to like it. It will be bad, but it won't be awful. It won't be the end of the world. People who hold preferences also have what we call high frustration tolerance. It's an important sentence because it contains the word frustration and the need to tolerate it. Because if I don't get what I want, if you don't get what you want, you will find it frustrating and challenging, and you're allowed to. But you can cope with the frustration, you can cope with the challenge. And that's high frustration tolerance. So if the presentation doesn't go well, I will find that difficult to deal with, but I also know I can cope with that. Finally, people who hold flexible preferences are much more likely to exhibit what we call unconditional acceptance. There's unconditional acceptance of the self. So I'm not a failure and I'm not an idiot. Even if it doesn't go well, I'm a worthwhile, fallible human being. Other people aren't idiots or failures either. Even if they're not behaving how I would like them to, they are also worthwhile, fallible human beings. And we also accept things, situations. So if the presentation doesn't go as well as I would like, it's not a complete write-off, it's not a total fail, it will have contained good bits and bad bits, just like life. So every single one of those unhealthy beliefs is a healthy, rational equivalent. The unhealthy beliefs disturb you, they give you poor psychological results, and the healthy beliefs will lead you to act in a more rational and more capable manner. Now, if we were to work on things in a specific context, we have this. And this, I hope for very obvious reasons, is known as the ABCDE model of psychological health. A stands for the activating event. It's the thing. So the presentation is the activating event, for instance. More importantly, it's the desire to do well that is the activating event. Over at C, we have consequences. Consequences are your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviors, your symptoms, your emotions. Now, if you really want to do well in a presentation, then it is going to influence how you think and how you feel and how you act. But it's only an influence. More directly, it triggers a belief system, and it's the belief system that kicks in those consequences. So if I'm telling myself that I have to do well, end of, I'm going to feel anxious at C. If my interpretation is, well, I'd like to do well, but I don't have to, then at C, I'm going to be nervous or concerned or worried, but more competent and more in control. So in REBT, we identify somebody's unhealthy beliefs, the beliefs that are disturbing them. And then we formulate healthy alternatives to those beliefs. With both sets of beliefs in place, we move on to D. D stands for disputing. It's the process of challenging your beliefs. over and over again with various exercises, weakening the unhealthy beliefs and strengthening the healthy ones. Little by little, we're just affecting a shift from one way of thinking to the other. Now, when you can feel that shift take place, we know we've arrived at E, because E means I now have a more effective, more rational outlook to that original activating event. Now, the D part, disputing, it's a number of exercises. The very first exercise, the primary exercise, is just called disputing. And we challenge your beliefs with 3 questions. And those questions are, is this belief true? Does this belief make sense? Does this belief help me? Truth, sense, helpfulness. Is it true is an evidence-based question. Whether you say, yes, it's true, or whether you say, actually, no, it's false, either way, you need to back your answer up with some kind of evidence, some kind of proof. Does it make sense is a common sense approach. Just because I think this, does it logically follow that? Just because I want this to happen, does it logically follow that? And does it help me is hopefully the most obvious one. You might want to get under control. You might want to react in a new manner. You might want to deal with your anxiety and your anger issues better than you do. And you just ask yourself, does that belief help me to do that? Yes or no? Now, these questions might sound quite simple, and on one level they are, but they're also incredibly rational, incredibly objective questions. And they're so rational and they're so objective that they're used everywhere. Maths, science, philosophy, politics, debating teams up and down the country, anywhere where anyone comes up with a policy or a philosophy or a thing, somebody else can pop up and challenge it with these questions to see what holds up and what falls apart. And it's very important here because on a daily basis, we have between 60 and 80,000 thoughts bombing around our heads. That's between 2,500 and 3,500 thoughts per hour. And very rarely, if ever, do we question the validity of those thoughts to find out if this thought is true, if it's sensible, if it's actually helping me. We just think, we react instantaneously. So disputing is an excellent way of just taking a step back. So take the demand, for instance, I must do well in my presentations. That belief isn't true. I can prove it. I've given presentations before when things have gone wrong. Either I've made mistakes or there have been technical hitches. There probably will be more mistakes going forwards because that's life. You can't deny the fact that things don't always go according to plan. Now, if I can prove that things haven't, and I can't guarantee that they won't going forwards, then telling myself it mustn't happen can't be true. Now, hopefully, if I'm presenting and I'm doing well, it's important to me. I care. So, of course, I prefer to do well. But just because I prefer to do well, it doesn't logically follow that I have to. They're actually saying 2 different things. One's quite reasonable. I hope I do well. The other one's unreasonable. So I absolutely have to all the time. End of. Now, the demand won't help me. It'll make me stressed. It'll make me anxious. It means that I will communicate that stress and anxiety. I will be less likely to do well in that presentation. So any demand that you can make isn't true, doesn't make sense, doesn't help. The preference, on the other hand, is yes, yes, and yes. It is true. Of course, I'd prefer to do well. Otherwise, why am I doing this? If I didn't have the preference, I wouldn't care. If I didn't care, I'd either come across as wooden and boring or overconfident. So I prefer to do well, but I don't have to because things can go awry. So the statement is true. It's also sensible because they're 2 reasonable statements. Yes, I'd like to do well, but as much as I like to do well, I live in a world where things don't always go according to plan. And it's much more likely to help me. I will be more calm. Nervous maybe, or nervously excited, but more calm, more in control, hopefully more capable. So you can dispute any of those 4 unhealthy beliefs, and you can dispute any 4 of those healthy beliefs. Now, when it comes to the 4 thoughts, self-damning and unconditional acceptance are kind of key to kindness and self-compassion. which is what Mental Health Week is all about. Now, if you hold any of those disturbing thoughts, if you are disturbing yourself, it's going to be much harder to be kind to yourself, kind to others, especially if you're putting yourself or other people down. However, if you hold an unconditional acceptance belief, so if you see yourself and other people as worthwhile but fallible human beings, it's much more likely that you'll put your mistakes into context, that you'll see their mistakes in context, and you will find it easier for yourself to be compassionate for you and to other people. And this notion of unconditional acceptance is a key component of another kind of therapy called compassion focused therapy, which is also a form of CBT, but a much newer one than REBT. As I said, REBT has been around since the mid-50s. So these unconditional acceptance beliefs, well, first of all, put downs, we can attack in the same way. They're not true. They don't make sense. They don't help you. The only way you could be a complete failure is if you had only ever failed in life. But we can all evidence failure, but we can all evidence success. There are things we get right, there are things we get wrong. There are things we like about ourselves, but there are things that we don't. All the successes, all the achievements, and all the things that we like about ourselves prove that we're not useless, rubbish, a failure, any of those put down words. And that's exactly the same with other people too. Even when they're behaving in an idiotic manner, there will be still things that they've done well. Now, it doesn't make any sense to take a failing or a flaw and then completely define yourself by that flaw. A failing does not a failure make. They're two different concepts. One's an attribute, the other one's all of you in your entirety. And it doesn't help you. When you put yourself down, you are very self-critical, you're more prone to anxiety, you're more prone to depression. When you criticize others, then you're more prone to outbursts of anger and blame and resentment and grudge holding. So again, put downs, not true, don't make sense, don't help you. Unconditional acceptance. I'm not a failure, even if this goes wrong. I'm a worthwhile, fallible human being. Well, I can prove I'm not a failure. I get things right. I succeed. I have presentations that have gone well. I can prove that I'm fallible. Fallible means that you can make mistakes. Fallible also means you can have flaws. We have physical flaws. Some people go bald early. Some people they get arthritis. Some people dodgy lungs. We have physical flaws. But we also have psychological flaws. Some people are prone to anxiety, to depression. Some people are too meek. Some people are too bossy. We all have them. Everybody does. Now, because we are all a combination of our successes and our failures, that just makes us human. And to be human means we are worthwhile. We're all born, we all live, and we all die. As we're doing the living bit, we get it right, we get it wrong. No one really has a clue what the hell's going on. We're all doing our best. So humanity is worthy. People are worthy. You are worthy. The whole thing is demonstrable. Can't be a failure, you get it right. Can be worthy, you're a human being. Are fallible, you make mistakes. It's the only logical way to look at a person. You can rate individual aspects, good at that, rubbish at that. But overall, you look at the bigger picture. And it's much more likely to help you. So if you accept yourself unconditionally, you will be self-compassionate, not self-critical. And again, if you accept others unconditionally, you won't be so resentful or angry or quick to blame or judge. You're more compassionate. And compassion and kindness are kind of interlinked. And kindness isn't just a central component of REBT, it's a big part of positive psychology. Positive psychology has again been a therapy that's been around since the mid-50s. Whereas most forms of psychotherapy completely focus on mental illness, positive psychology completely focuses on mental health. It looks at how we can become happier, how we can become more satisfied with our lives. It rose to prominence in the late 90s when a psychologist called Martin Seligman chose it as the theme for his tenure as president of the American Psychiatric Association. And it's been very popular since then. So it's the art and the science and the therapy of looking at how to be more happy and more satisfied than you are. And kindness is a key component of it. Kindness is considered a strength. Positive psychology makes a big deal of what it calls signature strengths. We all have things in life that we're good at, and we all have things in life that we are weak on. For an example, going back to school, I went round my mum's before the lockdown, and for some reason she dug out all my school reports. And year after year, they said the same thing. Handwriting is rubbish, no good at maths, no good at physics, must try harder. And we were talking about it. And I remember year after year, my mum was disappointed. I'd get more homework, I'd have to practice my handwriting. And I felt very discouraged because I had no aptitude in those areas. So all I got was more stress. My strengths, the things that I were good at, English language and literature, biology, chemistry. If my report had said, don't worry about the maths, focus on these, these are your strengths, do more of them, I'd have been happier. So we all have strengths, things that we are good at. And positive psychology helps you to identify your strengths and then think about how you can play to those strengths in your personal and your professional life. And kindness is considered a strength. But it's one that if you're not particularly good at it, with practice, you can become stronger at it. So what was once a weak point can become a strength. Kindness is also something that makes you feel good. It triggers the release of happy hormones, endorphins, serotonin, dopamine, when you do nice things for other people. So in a weird way, kindness is a bit selfish because every time you do something nice for somebody else, you feel good. And in feeling good, because it releases those endorphins, it strengthens your immune system. It makes you feel happier with your life and your circumstances, no matter what they are. It makes you feel more connected to other people. It makes you feel more social. It also makes other people feel good as well. So if I do something kind for somebody, I feel good, but hopefully so do they, the recipient of the kindness. And kindness is something that's backed up massively by science. In 2016, there was this big study by Oxford University. It's a funny number, but they took 691 people and split them more or less down the middle as much as you can with 691 people. One was a control group that did nothing, and the other half of the group were told to undertake random acts of kindness several times a day, every day for a week. Now, all the acts of kindness were chosen for their ease and their affordability. So they were easy to enact and they were cheap, so they weren't going to cost you too much. At the end of the experiment, they rated everyone's mood before and then at the end of the experiment. And all the people that undertook the kindness acts felt 42% happier than all those who didn't. And more importantly, the overwhelming majority said they felt so good that they wanted to carry on with those acts of kindness. Another study, I think in the same year, was with Oxford in conjunction with Bournemouth, and they just collected every single study ever undertaken on kindness to crunch all the numbers and found out that yes, acts of kindness statistically improve your mood, your physical health, your mental health, and your life satisfaction levels. And it was either last year or the year before, Interflora just did a very simple social experiment. So they sent their florists out onto the streets of London and just handed out roses to people and paid them a compliment, but also asked them to pass it on. So hand a rose, nice compliment, do the same thing to somebody else. But researchers were on hand to nab the people to find out how they felt. And not only did they feel happy receiving the rose and the compliment, they also felt really, really happy passing it on. There are websites that are devoted to happiness and kindness. Happify.com is all about positive psychology, but there are lots of studies into kindness and all the wonderful benefits that it can bring on its site. Another one is kindness.org, and that does exactly what it says on the tin. And it has something like 400 scientists spread across 45 different countries, all actively engaged in kindness in all its forms. And they have something like over 1,000 registered, documented acts of kindness that help you and others feel better. There's also another one called Helpful Peeps that you might have heard of. It's a website that was started a few years ago by two entrepreneurs who were absolutely fed up with Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and all the negativity. And they just wanted to know that if it was possible to create a social network that was kind. And so it's just people doing favors for other people. So if you've put your back out and you need your fence being creosoted, you put a little post up and somebody comes around and does your fence for you. If you are a guitar teacher and you want to learn Spanish, you'll say that you're willing to swap guitar lessons for Spanish lessons. And it's just a website full of people doing favors for one another for no other reason than it's the nice thing to do. And it's actually, as a website and as a social community, doing very, very well in a number of countries. So when the people that started it up posed the question, can you create a nice social network? The answer is yes. Now, acts of kindness can include many things. Here are just a few. Writing a thank you note, complimenting someone, but sincerely, cutting out an article or a story and sending it to somebody or giving it to them, leaving random have a nice day notes in places. In my local park, there are a bunch of school children that regularly do this. So you'll walk around the park and you'll find little painted rocks that say nice things on them, or little paper leaves hanging in the tree with just happy messages on them. All these things I've listed here and more, most of the exercises, they're easy, they're affordable. And in January, I work for a psychiatric hospital. It spent a whole month asking people to undertake acts of kindness. So it just put calendars up all around the hospital, asking people to do kind things, including some of the ones mentioned here. But basically, any act of kindness is just you doing something spontaneous and generous to someone without expecting anything back in return. So that, in essence, can cover anything. We have that whole movement, pay it forward. A lot of the time when you're paying it forward in a shop, you have no idea who is going to be the recipient of whatever it is that you're paying forward. But it will make you feel good, and it ultimately means that somebody else is going to feel good because you've paid it forward. Now, science likes to study. REBT has been studied extensively to discover that as a therapy, it's very, 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 very efficacious in the treatment of anxiety, depression, anger management, jealousy issues, and on and on and on. But science has also studied happy people, and happy people tend to do things a little differently than the rest of us. Happy people express gratitude on a regular basis. They're more optimistic. They avoid social comparisons, so they developed the art of unconditional acceptance. They nurture their social relationships. They practice acts of kindness on a regular basis. They develop strategies for coping. So seeing something as bad but not awful, as difficult but bearable, the components of REBT are a good strategy for coping. They learn to forgive people more easily, more readily. They increase flow experiences, and that means they just do more of whatever they like to lose themselves in, whether it's reading a book, watching a movie, going for a walk. They savor life's joys, so they stop to appreciate things. They set goals. Both REBT and positive psychology are very goal directed. They look at where you are, where you want to be, and how they can get you there. Happy people also practice spirituality and take care of their bodies physically. So that, in a nutshell, really is both REBT and kindness. There's more about REBT in my book, and I would consider it a huge kindness if you went out and bought a copy, and my publisher would also be very appreciative as well. So this is the point in the presentation where you get to ask me questions. I think Amber is moderating them, and I hope you've enjoyed my presentation.
Thank you, Daniel, for your presentation. You really weren't joking about that dog snoring.
Sorry about that.
Don't worry. But yeah, we have the questions on Slido now. If you haven't looked into that, guys, you can go on slido.com and enter in 4 thoughts to get in a last minute question. I do just want to say that some of the best questions may get received Daniel's book. And we may raffle some off as well. So if there are any questions and you want your name on there, please leave it, and then you may or may not get a book out of it. So I will then just present the screen now. Let's see.
Dun, dun, dun.
Here we go.
I can see the first question. Is the dog snoring? Yes. I have a dog. She's also a therapy dog. She's a registered therapy animal. So I'm also a proponent of animal-assisted therapy as part of what I do. But yes, that is a dog snoring at my feet. Are there any techniques to help identify and support others where you recognize that they're having irrational beliefs? Yes, you can drop hopefully things that you've learned from today and from my book, if you read it, just into conversation. Many years ago, when I was learning this as a therapy, I had a friend that was going through a lot. And I'd just practice it on her. I'd just drop little bits and pieces into the conversation. So I'd drop the notion of demands versus preference. Whenever she awfulized something, I'd help her to see that maybe it was bad but not awful. If she was going on about how something was intolerable, I'd help her to understand that it wasn't. I'd use those disputing questions. And slowly, and this was not in any kind of formalized way, you know, we'd meet for a drink here, we'd go out for lunch there. And her side of the conversation kind of went like this. What are you doing? Why are you talking to me like that? Oh my God, that's REBT. I know what you're doing. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. It isn't. It isn't. And then one day she just walked into a bar or a restaurant and went, I hate you. And the reason that she hated me is because she'd gone to have a reaction to something and just heard one of these snippets dropped into the conversation, and it just headed everything on at the pass. So if you hear people, and we say these things in everyday language, we'll tell ourselves that things shouldn't happen or they mustn't be that way, that this situation is awful, that it is unbearable. And we hear people put themselves down on other people all the time. Well, we can just drop those disputing questions into a conversation and just help people think in a different way. Are there any practical tips on eliminating unhealthy thought patterns? Yeah, unfortunately, it's the hard way. Sheer repetition. You identify your unhealthy beliefs and you challenge them over and over and over again. And once you've done that enough times, you forcibly choose to live in accordance with the healthy beliefs. And through sheer repetition, you eliminate those unhealthy thought patterns. But it's like anything in life, the only way you get good at anything is to do it repeatedly. Hopefully that answers the next question. How do you consciously get into a routine of becoming rational? Again, repetition, repetition, repetition. That disputing, those three questions, that's a core skill. Taking that step back and questioning again and again the validity of your thoughts, separating the ones that are true from the ones that aren't, the ones that don't make sense from the ones that do, the ones that are helpful from the ones that aren't, and then consciously deciding to operate according to the ones that you can prove are true and do make sense and do help you. What's the E in the ABCDE model stand for? Anything you'd like. Basically, many years ago, somebody really wanted a model that said ABCDE because it rolls off the tongue. Activating events, things, trigger beliefs that cause consequences or reactions. The E stands for an effective, rational outlook. So going back to that presenting model, it's where the person that was stressed out and anxious about presenting becomes perhaps nervously excited, but more calm and in control about presenting. So it's an effective, rational outlook. Any tips to eliminate unhealthy beliefs with kids? The lockdown has me in a constant struggle with them. Actually, kids respond obviously to REBT delivered in a more simplistic way, but they do respond to it. They get it sometimes perhaps more readily than adults do because their thinking isn't as ingrained. You could turn it into a game. So prove it. Does that make sense? Does that help anybody? That becomes a game. The preference is a much better way of dealing with children. Rather than tell them that they have to do this or they should do that, just say, Mummy, Daddy would prefer it if you did it. You don't have to, but I prefer it. And you're much more likely with practice to get a child on board with whatever it is that you're asking by expressing it as a preference rather than a just do it. How are thoughts quantified? That's a good one. Not entirely sure what you mean, so I'm going to assume a meaning for that one. How are they quantified? Rigorously in a laboratory with a bunch of researchers. So thoughts are quantified as in they're counted, and you put a brain in a scanner and you can literally see how neurons firing up, and you can count how many thoughts are going on at any given half hour, day. But also our thoughts are quantified through psychometric testing. So many experiments in many different therapies have quantified thoughts to find out, are they disturbing? How disturbing? What kind of disturbance? Is that thought promoting psychological well-being? How so? To what statistical significance? All the cognitive behavior therapies have been very heavily researched. They're empirical therapies. So thoughts and their intensity have been studied over and over again in a variety of settings and a variety of ways. Do you have any advice for dealing with or reframing past perceived failures? Absolutely. Depression is an emotion that's very much concerned with looking back, because we tend to depress ourselves about stuff that has happened and can't be changed, especially the losses and the failures of life. There are lots of books out there by business people and entrepreneurs, like the 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. And they do have a commonality. And one of the biggest things they have in common is when asked, how did you get where you are? They go by making every single mistake that you could possibly make and then inventing a few new ones. More importantly, they never put themselves down for their failings. They use them as opportunities to learn. You will have failed in the past. Now, we all have. It's a common theme. There isn't a human being in this planet that hasn't failed at something. Work, exams, relationships, you name it. The trick is to look at the failure. You don't have to like it, but you don't attach the value judgment to it. So it is a failing, but you are not a failure. Now, if it's for something like a relationship, it's very rarely black and white. There's normally a reason a relationship fails. It's the same with work. There's normally a reason a work relationship sours. But even if it's very black and white, if it's actually your failing, then it's not indicative of your character or you in your entirety. It becomes something that you can learn from. Right. Okay. I have high, although reasonable, expectations of myself. How can I manage my frustrations with others who don't hold similar expectations? Oh, that's a good one. The key of REBT is emotional responsibility. So I am responsible for how I think and how I feel and how I act. I'm not responsible for anybody else. I'm only responsible for me. Other people have every right to think and feel and act and respond how they want to. Now, I might have high standards, but it doesn't mean that everybody else has to match my standards. They have standards of their own. Now, if I hold demands that people have to meet my expectations, that it is awful if they don't, that I can't stand it if they don't, and I put them down because they don't, I'm not going to behave in ways that are very conducive to any kind of relationship or compromise. But when I look at life through the filter of the beliefs, the healthy ones, when I look at other people's behaviors, I can manage my expectations more effectively. I can either just accept that people aren't going to meet my level, or I can discuss things with them in a reasonable fashion. I can agree a compromise. But it's a sad fact of life. People don't have to do what you want them to do just because you want them to do it. If I think I'm not good enough at something, I think it's true and that it makes sense, but wouldn't think it helps me. How do I get to a point where I feel all three? Rigorously, repeatedly. Disputing is just one exercise to challenge your beliefs. There are others. Disputing is the fundamental, it's the core. But to actually get you to believe something, you have to work on it a bit more extensively than just proving it untrue, not sensible, and not helpful. You then have to persuade yourself to drop the unhealthy belief and embrace the healthy. So unfortunately, it's not as simple as just disputing your beliefs with those three questions. You have to increase the challenge in complexity. But just because you have failed at something or are not good at something, it doesn't make you no good as a person. Once you can prove that, well, then you ask yourself, how does it help me? If it's not true, how does it help me to say I'm no good? But if you repeatedly go, well, it's not true that I'm no good, and you remind yourself of everything you can do well, and repeatedly question the helpfulness of the thought that isn't true, then eventually over time, it takes longer, but you will be able to affect that shift. The only way you can truly feel it is by doing it repeatedly. Do you have any recommendations to practice in order to remind yourself of the important reminders you've discussed today in your daily routine? Lots and lots of books have been written on REBT. There are lots of resources on REBT online. If you Google REBT, worksheets will come up. There are workbooks for dummies that have both got CBT and REBT in them. Books by B, books by two of my mentors. One was a guy called Avi Joseph, the other one was a guy called Windy Dryden. They both, between them, written many books on the subject. Thankfully, most of them are mercifully short, so they're not a big ask in terms of reading time. Do you have any suggestions for acts of kindness in these times while social distancing or staying at home? Yes. Phoning up somebody that you haven't talked to in ages. And reminiscing, sharing happy memories of the past with them. Phoning up people just to say that you appreciate them even in these difficult times. Remembering people's birthdays, sending people just little notes of thank you, or even just to say, I'm thinking of you in this time. Don't know if many people remember this. There used to be an advert from British Telecom, I think it was in the 80s. You went, I saw this and thought of you. And it was just people posting things to people and going, here. You can do that. Cut out a magazine article if you think that somebody you know would like it. See a silly picture in a magazine that you think somebody else would like and send it to them, a joke. Post it. There is a postal service. Scan it and email it. Let people know you're thinking of them. There's no bigger act of kindness than remembering somebody. What are your thoughts on being kind versus the fear of being abused? That all depends. Abuse happens. I work in therapy with people who have been abused, and they have to learn how to forgive the abuser in order to move on. Now, forgiving the abuser is not in any way, shape or form to let them off the hook. It's to get you off the hook, or off the guilt, or the anger, or the anxiety. When somebody has been abused, my job is to help them get rid of every disturbing thought that is preventing them from moving forwards, including the thoughts of the abuser. The best thing you can do with abuse is utterly forget the person that did it and move on with your life to the best of your ability. Being kind in general doesn't mean being kind to your abuser. When we come to this whole notion of worthwhile but fallible, that does apply to everybody. But if you can think of a character sketch, if you draw a picture of somebody and for every nice attribute you put a tick, and for every negative attribute you put a cross, then you might realize that there are enough crosses in the picture of somebody that you just don't want them around. You forgive them, but you drop them, you move away. You don't have to think of them at all. You certainly don't have to do the abuser a kindness. Can the approach be taken too far? So, yeah, you can become too rational. You can become far too pragmatic. We're not trying to encourage you to be emotionless robots. We're not asking you to take every single knock on the chin with utter pragmatism. In REBT, we have unhealthy negative emotions and healthy negative emotions. And very, very simplistically, an unhealthy negative emotion is an emotion that controls you. A healthy negative emotion is one that you are in control of. We want you to emote, but we want you to emote in ways that are appropriate and healthy. We don't want you to take rationality too far. We don't want you to take kindness too far. Be kind by all means, but not to everybody that, you know, might potentially do you harm. Do you have any tips for turning a negative thought or a reaction into a more positive one in the moment so that you can change how you react? Yes. Disputing again, first step. First step in anything. Stop, think. Is that thought true? Does that thought make sense? Does that thought help? If not, drop it. I worked with several people in a number of areas. People that used to get so jealous of their partners, they'd run into the toilet to scream in jealousy. People that were so anxious about presentations that they'd hide in the toilets beforehand and have mini panic attacks and then go and do the presentation. When you work on them with REBT, you give them homework, you get them to write things down, and then you can still nip off to the toilet, but instead of having a jealous hissy fit or rage or a little mini breakdown before a presentation, you're actually reading through the homework again and again and again to get yourself under control. To varying degrees of success in various scenarios, but the idea is that with each practice, you get more and more successful, until with regular practice, you get so good, you don't have to nip off to the toilet to do anything. You're doing it in your head in the moment. I believe a friend of mine would benefit from therapy. What's the best way of telling them? All depends on the relationship with the friend. You know them. Would the blunt approach help? Just telling them that I think you could do with therapy. Treating it in an open-ended way, asking them if they're okay, asking them if they could maybe need help, asking them what they think that kind of help would look like, coming up with suggestions on your own. So there's the blunt approach, just tell them. There's the softly approach. Leaving books around. A friend of mine did this for her mum. She would pretend to read self-help therapy books and sit there reading them and go, and then her mum would go, what are you doing? Oh, nothing, this is for me. And then she'd leave it lying around, and her mum would pick the book up because she was nosy, start reading the book, and they eventually had a conversation, and the conversation led to her mum going, I think I might actually try some therapy. So it all depends on you and the relationship you have with your friend. You know the best approach to take. Oh, could you explain neuroplasticity, and do you think this would help? Absolutely. Yes. Our brains are plastic. They are malleable. They change shape depending on the input that you give it. And this never stops happening. A few decades ago, we thought that the brain was malleable until a certain age, then it became fixed, and whatever kind of brain you had, you were stuck with it. We have expressions that cover this. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. Rubbish, you can. Old people, old dogs, old cats, you can teach them new tricks. It doesn't matter what age you are. Let's say that you've never picked up a musical instrument in your life. You pick one up, day one. You are uncoordinated. You have no understanding of the instrument. You don't know how to read music. You start off very, very simplistically, but each day you practice a bit more, a bit more, a bit more. More importantly, as you do that, your brain is firing off new neurons based on coordination for that particular instrument, based on reading music, understanding it and hearing it. And your brain, if it was to be put on a scanner, would literally change shape. Your brain changes structure, it's neuroplastic in the face of your thoughts. So if you feed it a negative thought over and over and over again, your brain will change shape in response to the negative thought. It'll develop more neurons based on that negative thought. But by the same token, if you repeatedly challenge it with a rational thought or a happy thought or a kind thought, then over time, with repetition, your brain will change shape again to match the new input that you're giving it. Now, when we're younger, our brains are more plastic, they're more malleable than when we're older, but they are still malleable. It just takes a little bit more effort. Aha. If one tries to reframe a moral failure as a teachable moment rather than part of one's character, does that not minimize an action's negative effect on others? Hopefully, you have a conscience. So if you accept yourself as a worthwhile but fallible human being who had a moral failing, in accepting yourself, hopefully you will want to either make up for the failing, apologize for it, and not promise unrealistically to change, but to demonstrate change through a change in behavior and character. So by accepting yourself as a worthwhile, fallible human being, we don't want you just to go, look, I know I did that, but I'm fallible, deal with it. You are a human being. Hopefully you have compassion for others, and in having compassion for others, you will want to negate the action, atone for the action, do better going forwards. Oh, great presentation. In a kind society, how do we address justice and punishment? For example, a non-kind act that may cause offence and pain to somebody. Well, with justice and punishment, ultimately, we do believe that people are worthwhile and fallible. Our justice system and the punishment system are all based on the notion of rehabilitation, that you can do something horrible, be rehabilitated, and become a functioning member of society again. But that notion doesn't apply to everybody, because sometimes you realize, as worthwhile and fallible as somebody is, they've done too many things, or it's too ingrained that they are a menace to society forever, and so they get life sentences. But essential to justice and punishment is the notion of worth and fallibility. Now, if you've deliberately done a non-kind act to somebody, if it's deliberate, you may want to look at why. What beliefs did you hold that led you to do that? It actually takes a lot of effort to be deliberately unkind. Most of our unkindnesses just happen accidentally or through ignorance or through unintention, in which case we apologize and we make up for them, and hopefully both parties learn and move on. The unconditional acceptance of one's flaws and failures and mistakes is essential for this to work, but it's not as easy as it sounds. Sadly, no. If it was, one 40-minute presentation and you'd be healed, and I'd be charging an absolute fortune, and I'd be on TV all over the place. It takes effort. Accepting yourself if you have that critical inner voice and you are blaming yourself and you're beating yourself up for your flaws and failures, it takes regular, regimented practice to break that down, build up the alternative acceptance belief, and begin to believe in it and put it into practice on a daily basis. Words are one thing, actions are another. Knowing something is not the same as actually believing it enough to put it into daily practice. REBT and the ABCDE model is the journey of taking the lesson and believing it enough to put it into practice. What would you say you have learned the most from achieving this level of understanding in REBT? Being pretty unflappable. Like all human beings, I do have my Achilles heel, but I'm very level-headed in a way that I wasn't when I was younger. What advice would you give those whose thought patterns are more impulsive and find it difficult to dispute impulsive thoughts at the time of having them? Seek out the services of a professional to help you do that. All our thoughts and all our reactions seem instantaneous. Our language makes it seem instantaneous. So we say things like, you make me angry. We say things like, that thing makes me anxious. Because something happens and we react immediately. However, there's always a moment, doesn't matter how instantaneous it is, there is a moment between the thing and the reaction to the thing. That moment can be slowed down and challenged. Now, if you are having difficulty doing that yourself, self-help therapy books, or seek out the services of a professional. CBT therapies, all the CBT therapies are very, very good on homework. In every session, the therapist will talk about what you're doing, why you're doing it, how it can help you, and they will give you an assignment to bring back the next week in line with whatever that session was about. So it's teaching you the skills to dispute those thoughts, no matter how impulsive you are or how immediate that reaction feels. I think that is the last question. Lovely. Right, I hope that was enjoyable. I hope you learned something. And please feel free to buy a copy of my book if you would like to know more about REBT.